this story is something that happened with my grandmother where her and I were having a conversation, and she had some difficulties back home with some other family members. A little bit of family drama, nothing new. All right, everybody has it. And while we were talking about it, she was venting to me about the situation. We were beginning to discuss what exactly was going on with it. And she was telling me how, with the person she was in conflict with, she didn't feel like it was fixable. She felt like there were things that were said that couldn't be unsaid, and therefore the relationship had been tarnished and wasn't going to be able to be repaired. Now, listening as an outsider, it didn't really seem like it was that big of a deal, but I remember listening to her, really hearing what she was saying and empathizing with the situation that she had brought up to me. And it reminded me of something because she had actually said to me this phrase, and this is what kind of brought this up, and this is actually has created the theme for the episode. So she said this. She said, even if we could fix it, it would be like repairing a broken glass where you could still see the cracks, and it just would never be the same again. And it reminded me of something called Kintsugi. Now, Kintsugi, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the Japanese art of repairing pottery with gold lining. And this is a practice that started in ancient Japan, where one of the shoguns had broken his favorite tea bowl, and he was devastated by this. So he wanted to actually have it repaired. So what he did is he sent the tea bowl to China to have it repaired, as that was something that was offered. Now, when he had sent the tea bowl, they had sent it back to him with staples, literally, bringing the cracks together, and it looked ridiculous. Like, first of all, he was never going to use this in front of anybody, let alone he wasn't going to use this for himself because it just looked like shit with all these staples in a tea bowl. But he also thought to himself, there has to be a better way. So he gave the tea bowl to one of his craftsmen and told him, he said, I need you to fix this and I need you to make it look good. All right, I can't have this thing with staples all in it. So after a while of going through and making these repairs, what he ended up doing is he made the repairs, but he didn't just glue it together. He didn't just put an adhesive. He actually put gold powder into the adhesive and repaired the tea bowl that way. So when the tea bowl came back, the tea bowl had all the cracks from before, from where it had been broken, except these cracks were lined with gold rather than just being transparent cracks or stapled together, which obviously looked ridiculous. And when he brought it to the emperor, and when he brought it to the shogun was very, very pleased with it. He was inspired. He loved it. And this became this new art form of actually repairing things. And Kintsugi, the really interesting thing about it is that what it does is it doesn't try to hide the flaws of things, but instead it embraces them. So going back to the story with my grandmother, while her and I were talking, I remember I Googled Kintsugi, and while she was talking to me, and I did let her know ahead of time. I didn't just rudely grab my phone and start Googling, but I told her, I'm like, hey, I need to show you something. And so I pulled out my phone, I Googled Kintsugi because I knew about this practice, and it had been something that had always resonated with me. So when I pulled it up, I showed her this picture. I said, well, before I showed her the picture, I basically said to her, I said, you can look at it like that. You can look at it as seeing these cracks as something painful or something that you don't want to be looking at or that you want to avoid or that you're ashamed of. Or instead, you could see it like this. And I turned the phone around and I showed her this picture with this teapot with the gold cracks. And there was this moment that everything changed in her face. She just stopped her venting. She stopped the melodramatic state that she was in, and she started crying. But these were tears of joy because she had this breakthrough and where she realized that it didn't have to be something that wasn't repairable. In fact, maybe, just maybe, she could embrace these cracks, embrace where there was damage done, and instead turn this into something beautiful. So it reminded me of this, and it was a moment I was able to share with my grandmother where it felt like time stopped. It felt like we had this moment of clarity, this moment of realization together, and we had this really awesome memory that was formed out of this conversation. I wanted to bring it to the podcast today because Kintsugi is something that has been done to obviously make broken pottery look beautiful, but at the same time, it's a philosophy that we can carry with us into our lives without having to shame ourselves for the vulnerabilities that we have, or the flaws or the regrets of our past, we can always repair them or reframe the way that we think about them by aligning them with gold, so to speak. There is a concept here that I always talk about with my clients, especially when I'm doing something like what I like to call the liberation session, which is a session where a client and I sit down for 8 hours and go into this, active imagination, meditative state where I'm having a dialogue with them. And they're in this meditative state. And what we're doing in that position, what we're doing in that particular exercise or that session, is we're going through this process where essentially we are in the now. Obviously, we're not time traveling, but we are in the now. And what I explained to the client is that now is the convergence point where anything can change. You can either make a decision to change your future, or you can make a decision to rewrite the way that you see the past. You can see it from a different vantage point or see it from a different perspective. And right now is where you can define the past. The past doesn't define who you are today. The regrets, the poor decisions, the things that you look back and you cringe at yourself for, these are not the things that define you today or determine where you're going. It is now where you're able to actually have that convergence point, that moment where you can choose to make the decision in a different direction. And so I explain this to my clients with a metaphor that was actually used by the philosopher Alan Watts, where he talked about how you can look at yourself as a ship going through the ocean or going through the sea. And as the ship goes through, behind the ship, there are going to be wakes that the ship is leaving in the past. But the wakes of the ship have no bearing on where that ship is going. It's not going to tell you where this ship is going to go or what direction it's even headed in. All it can tell you is where the ship has been. And after enough time, those wakes disappear into the vast ocean, just like our past seems to disappear. And the way that we remember it is not always accurate. So sometimes we distort our own memories of the past, and by distorting them, we end up living in the present now and determining what our future could be based on these distorted memories. And the distortion comes from having an emotional charge or an emotional attachment to these memories. Now, where this comes back to Kintsugi is that we can always have this perspective where we look back on these memories, we look back on these flaws of our past or the bad decisions or the moments that were uncomfortable or unpleasant, and we can embrace them. We can actually use them as something that makes our lives beautiful, something that makes our character beautiful by showing and embracing where we've been hurt, where we've had our suffering in the past. Because like the ship doesn't decide where it's going to go based on the wakes of the past. It decides where it's going to go right now, where it's at. It can choose to change directions at any point in time. So it'd be ridiculous to think that the wakes of the ship are telling you where it's going. And bringing it back to what Alan Watts would say is, it's like saying the tail wags the dog. It doesn't make any sense, right, to say that. The dog is wagging the tail. So what this is to say is that you can choose to define your past via your present. The present defines the past. The past doesn't define the present or define where the future is going. So what we can do to start is look at our past and look at it with an open heart. Look at it in a way that allows us to see it as something beautiful, something to be grateful for, and to learn from it. The thing is, when we look at things and we feel bad about them, we feel uncomfortable about what has happened, the problem with that is that it puts us into a disempowered state where we have this negative emotional charge or this charge of unpleasant emotions. And being that we have that charge of unpleasant emotions, it will cause us to create that distortion. So what we can do instead is learn from it or choose to see it in a different perspective by looking back and maybe asking ourselves, well, what did I learn there? What did that moment have to teach me? Or a question that I really like to use is, what was the gift there? Now, that question is especially powerful because what it does is it has a presupposed belief loaded into the question, which is that there is a gift here. There is something that you can find here. And when I think about the gift that exists within these memories or within these, bad times, so to speak, the gift there is what that gold lining is going to be made of. Right? If you can look back on the past and look back on a decision that used to cause you suffering and instead see it in a way that creates a gift for your life now and in the future, that is like repairing the cracks with gold. And that is what allows us to embrace our past, to embrace the imperfections of life, and instead turn them into something that actually brings character into our lives. Now, kintsugi, the interesting thing about it is that the literal translation means to repair with gold. And when you repair with gold, what we're doing is we're shining light on the things that would typically be considered flaws. And instead of looking at them as flaws, we can look at them as gifts.